our panel member with. So first, thank you so much to our panelists for coming. To kind of intro this session really quickly, essentially we decided to kind of expand what we were doing here in the SMFM Patient Safety and Quality Committee. In that, our regular meetings were every other month, and we were doing a lot of, committee business, working on a ton of projects, a lot of documents and publications to kind of move forward patient safety and quality across the OB community. But in our recent strategic planning that we did around the committee, led by Dr. Davidson, we uncovered that a lot of committee members sort of joined this committee, not just with the goal of, producing products, but to also come away with improved knowledge and skills around QI for them to take back to, their local communities and hospitals. So we really wanted, between our sort of traditional meetings and all the business that we were trying to do, to hold sessions on a variety of topics that we thought would be of value to our members. And we did ask members, what those types of sessions would be like and what people would want to hear about. And one of the most popular responses by far was this idea around how to publish in QI. So we invited here some people who both work in the leadership of publishing as well as have published a ton in QI. Our committee, for our panel members to know, is made up of a variety of people. We have senior physicians on this call who have, like Dr. Combs, who have tons and tons of publications related to quality improvement. And then we also have a lot of people at the start of their careers. We have a lot of both resident and fellow members of our committee as well, who are very interested in moving forward in QI. And so I wanted to start hopefully by just having our panelists introduce themselves. If you want to give a little bit of background on yourself, your career, and your role in sort of QI publications, and some general thoughts to start us off in this conversation. We meant for this to be really casual. I sent our speakers some prompt questions that we can get to after our introductions. I think there's a lot to talk about here, so I'm really excited to get started today. And thank you to all to everyone who decided to come today. So I go around. We can start with who I'm looking at first. Dr. Moniz, do you want to start?
Sure, happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Moniz. I'm a generalist OB/GYN at the University of Michigan, and I'm the program director for the Obstetrics Initiative, which is our perinatal quality collaborative for maternity care in the state of Michigan. And I've published a little bit on some quality improvement topics, largely with. Well, I'm not sure I live up to that billing, Rebecca, so I want to be careful about that. But my background and training is in health services research, and my K award was really focused on implementation science. And so that's the lens that I bring to the work that I do. And I'm so excited to be having this conversation. I think there's just so much we can be doing in the quality improvement space. This is such a powerful effector arm for the evidence that our field is generating to make sure that we are really baking that evidence into routine care delivery. So thank you for the opportunity to be part of the dialogue today.
Dr. Srinivas, thank you for joining us. We are just going around and doing introductions. We did a little intro to, why we're doing the session today, and that we have a variety of people on our committee who've all been, asking for, educational sessions around quality improvement, and this was sort of the most popular topic that people asked for us to have a session on. Dr. Miller, I see you next.
Hello, also very happy to be here and excited for this conversation. I was sharing with the panelists before. Forgive me if I go into states of rage after the SCOTUS decision, and just it's an okay space to be a little bit angry today, or a lot angry. So sorry if I feel a little distracted. So I'm a maternal-fetal medicine doc. I was at Northwestern for 15 years, very grateful, did all my training there, had amazing friends and colleagues there, and then moved a year ago, almost exactly today, to Brown, and I'm the division director for MFM here. I am also a health services researcher. My focus has been on perinatal mental health. And I guess just very briefly, my case started in the field of psychoneuroimmunology. which is super cool. And I had a lot of fun doing it, trying to look at neuroinflammatory biomarkers and mechanisms of disease. But very much believe we have to create the change we want to see in the world, and a lot in obstetric settings pertaining to perinatal mental health revolves around programmatic interventions and complex programmatic interventions, because these are things that aren't just take a pill and everything gets better, or do an easy randomized trial, or use existing data sets. There was a lot of programmatic change that needed to happen. So that got me similarly into implementation science, to not only be able to evaluate efficacy and effectiveness, but understand when there are deviations in efficacy or effectiveness, how implementation outcomes might mediate those differences. And then also use that to evaluate health equity. So yeah, just really excited to hear the experience of other folks, and how we can promote getting all the amazing QI work that I know is happening in hospitals around the country and clinics around the country to be disseminated, so we can all learn from each other. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Berghella, you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks for letting me join. So I'm an MFM at Jefferson. Right now I'm in Italy, so it's 11 p.m., way past my bedtime usually. So if I doze off, don't mind me. And Emily's on, so anything she says is much better than anything I could ever say. But you know better than me, it takes 17 years for something evidence-based, proven, to come to practice. And I read this recently in Nature and Science, something like that. And 1 in 5 things in obstetrics that is proven by evidence, it's practice. And that's when you come in, you know, in terms of the implementation science you've been talking about. I'm very frustrated by that, you know, that we know a lot of things that work, and you know, we don't implement them routinely. So I think you invited me because of AJOG, and in particular AJOG MFM. We would love to see, we meaning, you know, the journal editors, etc., more of this things practice, because again, we can do a wonderful randomized study, NIH and whatever, and prove something, and then nobody does it. And I could make, you know, dozens and dozens of things. I just came back. I actually went yesterday to the Cypriot meeting in Valencia, and you know, in Europe they practice completely different than us, and it's the same evidence. You know, they all read. So implementing what's correct, you know, because it's what's done in England is not done in the US, because what's done in the US is not done in Japan, just drives me nuts. So again, thanks for having me, and whatever I can do to help get you know, your work in print and, you know, implemented, things implemented be great. Sorry for the long-winded thing. I'm tired.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being here at nighttime in Italy. I understand. Cindy, you want to go next?
Did you say me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I think it cut out for a second. Thanks for having me as well. I'm really excited to join the conversation. There's just so many things that I could say, but I'm an MFM physician at Penn. I work with Rebecca. We've worked together for quite a while. And I think my research career really started actually in the sort of translational world, but quickly really was really wanted to get into health services research. But as we did sort of large data set sort of explorations, it sort of came back to, well, how do you actually change practice in the setting that you're in? And I think having an epi background and being a labor and delivery director allowed for a lot of kind of putting evaluation and more rigorous methodologic sort of solutions into QI work, but that was being done locally. And I agree, a lot of QI work isn't really published, but I think Rebecca and I joke that I think I've been sort of in practice for a while. So I think we're talking about some of the implementation science metrics before they existed, because at the end of the day, in order for something to actually be effective from a quality perspective, like you have to implement and you have to think about all the barriers and structures and processes that have to happen for it to actually be successfully implemented. So this sort of topic is very near and dear to my heart. And I'm no longer a labor and delivery director, but I am vice chair for quality and safety. And I'm also associate chief medical officer at our hospital now for quality and safety. So have a sort of a broader lens on quality and safety work and sort of some of the opportunities around, the importance of publishing that work, as we all sort of, I think, are doing a lot of the same things in different pockets, but aren't spreading the knowledge in a sort of a broad way. So thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, guys. So I'm going to start off with a question to get us moving, and then I'll open it up to the group for questions. If you guys want to ask questions by raising your hand, or and everyone's welcome to be on camera, obviously, or just jump in, however it's easier. This is meant to be casual. So I think that, a lot of us are doing tons of QI work in this committee. And many times people don't think about publishing their quality improvement work until it's already done and someone tells them, now's a good idea. What advice do you have for people just beginning QI projects about how to sort of optimize their chances to get published in terms of thinking about that from the very beginning in a quality improvement project? Anyone can jump in.
I'll get us started. By no means the expert on this, but I think the work that we do, publication is one intermediate outcome, and it's an important one. I don't want to diminish it, particularly for people early on. It's the currency with which you are going to move forward in your academic career. But really, the thing you're trying to do is to affect change in your healthcare system and then disseminate it, right? And you're never going to be able to do that without publication. But maybe more than just the publication, the intentionality that goes into what is required for publication and broader dissemination. And so for all of my trainees that have been, tortured by my mentorship for years, everything is a research project. Every intervention we do, we're not allowed to do, as the chief of obstetrics at Northwestern before I left, nothing we did was allowed to be done without dissemination, because it's so important that we learn from each other's both successes and learning opportunities. So I think the publication piece is important, but I think moreover, you're going to be more successful if you take that little bit of time beforehand to think about what are the structured approaches of what I need to do. What are the steps? What are the facilitators? What are the barriers? What, not just I chatted with 3 people, but more systematically, who are the core stakeholders that I want to engage with? What's the feedback that I need to solicit, et cetera? And so I think that intentionality is going to optimize your chance of publication, but I think, again, more importantly, affect change and allow other people to learn from what you're doing.
I think it's such an important caveat, Emily. I think that publication, when I think of it, is not for the goal of, yes, it all helps us in our careers, but for the goal of dissemination and sort of framing it in that way in terms of helping each other, do this kind of work. And that's a really important way to think about it.
I think, like anything else, we want to begin with the end in mind, and we absolutely should expect to publish our quality improvement work. And I totally agree with what Dr. Miller shared about that intentionality helping us do our work more effectively. And I think publication is necessary. We don't have time to be doing things and not learning from what we're doing. There's so many, our patients can't wait for us to figure out how to do this more effectively. So I think, we have large-scale projects happening across healthcare systems, across states, across even larger regional collaboratives, and we have to learn from everything we're doing. And if it doesn't work, it's kind of our responsibility to know why it didn't work and to make sure nobody else does it that way again, right? We want to constantly be working towards a more effective process and product where the families we're privileged to serve. So I think it's critical that we consider publication as necessary, in fact, with the work that we're doing. We're investing time and resources, human capital in this. We should absolutely be learning at every step of the way. And I think there are a lot of resources out there to help us. We have reporting guidelines. The Squire reporting guidelines are often a good one to start with for QI work. there are so many frameworks in implementation science that can really help us take what Dr. Miller was referencing. How do you get stakeholder engagement? Like there are surveys and, focus group guides, things that are sort of ready-made off the shelf that we can adapt and utilize, and a whole bunch of resources to help us think about what outcomes to measure and how to really elevate the quality and rigor of our approach to quality improvement. So I think I'm so glad we're having this dialogue and thinking about this, because I don't think we have any time to lose to be thinking in this way.
Two other thoughts.
Go ahead,
Go ahead, Sindhu.
I was just going to add, I agree with everything that's been said, but I was going to say, in addition, like, a lot of the times the data that you need to publish is actually really important in the process of implementing what you're doing, right? Like buy-in happens because you're sharing kind of like improvement with people. And so the part about publishing is, I think, a sort of small incremental increase in sort of work in terms of thinking about it up front and thinking about the kind of data that you might need to collect in addition to what you're showing as the outcome. But if you're sort of doing the implementation process around some of the QI work and really evaluating the improvement or the lack of improvement and sort of the de-implementation part, you're sort of should be already doing some of this data piece to actually share with people and help with the sort of buy-in. So to me, it's almost, Emily, I think I similarly have tortured my trainees for a long time. You pretty much have to, everything is like a project, right? Like you should really be thinking about it that way. Or many things. And so I think, but I think that part really helps with the actual process of implementing it as well.
Yeah, I agree. Sindhu, the two quick, action plan or, easy things, kind of low-hanging fruit I was going to share is, there are 85 OBGYN journals. And in particular research, so there are many opportunities, and research letters in particular now are liked more and more by some of the top, so all of these journals, and some of these projects are pretty straightforward. We were doing this for 2 years, we changed this for 2 months, and then we followed 2 more years, or they can be more complex, but often a table, a figure, 7,500 words. You don't need, to describe a lengthy laboratory technique or, fancy statistics and things that take a long time in papers. So that's my point number one. I agree. These things should be published. It's just that, for everything, reviewers in particular, if they see something that it's not changing practice, or it's not that novel, they may not like it. But if it's a quick research letter sharing something that maybe didn't work, and people shouldn't redo, we actually did a study recently. Negative studies are published in obstetrics just as much as positive studies, which I was surprised about, but that's what the data showed. So I think we try as reviewers and editors to publish negative studies as well. And for this kind of work, research letters will be good. And then the other thing I was going to say, many of you are or would be in ACOG, committees, in SMFM, publication, etc. committees. When you're there, make sure that these issues are because that's how you really change the world. A paper might change the world. But then, if there is an ACOG for us in the US, an ACOG or an SMFM guidelines, that's what usually really gets people, going. They're really going to change their practice and do what SMFM or ACOG does. So that's another major way to get this implementation work go. And when I've been on those committees before, we don't talk about the implementation. We just say, you should give vaginal progesterone, but hey, where do you buy it? How do you do it? What about if you don't have enough money? All the implementation issues, state differences, insurance issues, whatever. Doctors forgetting, reminder system, all the stuff better than me. That should be in those guidelines, ACOG and SMFM.
Yeah, we always work on having an implementation section in our documents.
And Rebecca, before you go on to the next question, this
Yeah.
was just all such great information. It made me think of, I feel like I'm wondering if you all could even also share pitfalls along the way, because I thought of something that was, that I had to learn the hard way with this, which is a lot of times when you're working on projects, you may not define your PDSA cycles. Like some of them may happen more organically, but then when you're trying to write everything up, you're like, when did I do that? And what was the timeline? And so I think what I've also learned is, in terms of thinking with the end in mind, really good record keeping as you're going through your project. And it's something that, like, I've learned, because you're working with large teams, you're working with nurses, you're working with students and residents sometimes too, and everyone has a different piece of the puzzle. But when you sit down to start writing it, it's really, then you're like digging through emails and trying to figure out, when did we actually do this actual part. So I would also recommend, for those of you getting started, to make sure you keep a good timeline as you're working through it.
I definitely don't want to totally dominate this conversation, but I have a million questions. But this one kind of goes along with what you just said, Christina, which is the PDSA cycle aspect, right? I think it's such amazing advice to keep track of it from the beginning, and it's something that I always struggle with, and we probably need better systems to be able to, record this as we go through, especially like complex projects at multiple sites. But when you're thinking about then, the manuscript preparation and sort of how this is really what kind of differentiates QI, right, from traditional research, is that the intervention is not static, and it's constantly changing or being adapted to the place that you're putting it in, and may change multiple times throughout the project that you are doing, and maybe a lot of times. How do you sort of see that best, like in your own work or another work that you've read? How do you see it best incorporated into an actual manuscript?
So it's actually really interesting. Like, I guess I feel like maybe I'll give a different kind of example of like where you might do multiple PDSA cycles to like get to the intervention. And then the question is are you studying it along the way, or like, is the thing that you're studying after you get to the final thing, and then the implementation or the QI part is like the sort of, and we could talk methodologically about sort of more rigor than just like a pre and post. But I guess I have an example of like where we actually wrote up the PDSA part as its own paper. So like the whole process of like, how do we iterate to get to the thing that we're getting to? And then the like actual, thing we implemented had its own sort of study, but sort of describe. And so the paper was really more of a qualitative description of the process of getting to that thing by 5 PDSA cycles of like 5, in our case, it was like 5 patients each or whatever. So I don't know if that's like one example, I guess, of how I've written up a PDSA work, is just sort of almost separating that process out from the sort of intervention test.
Yeah, and then you get 2 publications. So that was pretty sweet, Sindhu. That's a great tip. I'll go backwards to Christina's question real quick. I was just thinking about, I've made about 1 million pitfalls, but I was thinking more broad scoping about, career development tools I wish I had put in my toolbox earlier on, and maybe I'm too old to do so now. But qualitative research methodologies, I think my background was in epidemiology, then in translational neuroscience, and then in implementation science, because that makes sense. And the natural course of one's career in MFM. And words kind of scare me as someone with a background in epidemiology, but I think it's Brene Brown that says, stories are data with a soul. And now I think a lot about with CBPR work that I do and implementation science, how I really wish I had a rigorous methodologic training in qualitative research. So for anyone that's young enough to engage and do that, that is a piece that I think can make a huge difference. And if you're not like me, just find really awesome people that do this, do qualitative work that you can buddy up with, because you don't have to be an expert in everything. And thank you, Dr. Menard. I appreciate that encouragement.
Does anyone else want to jump in with a question?
Can I add one other thing that I just thought of to what
Yeah.
Christina brought up, which is, having I think the record keeping part, or just like kind of having some way to systematically kind of remember what you did, is like so important. And sometimes, one thing that I think can be helpful too is partnering, if you're a more like, depending on what part of your career, and if you're actually partnering with a student or a resident or a fellow that's doing the work, sort of like knowing that up front, and like kind of almost assigning, like knowing who's sort of kind of role it is to do that, so that there's somebody that's sort of thinking about that kind of up front, and maybe that's the person that sort of owns the publication and the project. And I think that's always a good thing to talk about up front if you can. And I think these kinds of projects are really exciting for students and trainees in particular, because it's sort of like addressing something that you're trying to improve in your own care delivery, and then seeing the sort of like fruits of doing that, I think is really inspiring for people that, in terms of continuing to do this from a career perspective.
I'll maybe jump in. Like one additional maybe piece of this puzzle on this question is like, when we're talking about adaptation, what exactly are we adapting or tailoring? So being really clear about, like, if we have an evidence-based intervention that was well described, and we have evidence of effectiveness and RCTs or, meta-analyses, that's the core thing that we're trying to get baked into practice. And conversely, an implementation strategy, a set of different activities that we're doing, may look kind of different when we're working with different contexts, different hospitals, different clinics. And so that's the piece where adaptation is not a bad thing. It's actually probably necessary to have a core set of activities that everybody probably needs, but then additional things that we add or take away based on local context. And being really clear then about what is the core, what are the pieces that are adaptable, and why, is so important for our findings, whether they are positive or negative, to be replicable. So I think just making sure to really think through those pieces with your team, write those things down at the beginning and throughout the process. And I think also from a pragmatic standpoint, recognizing that, in the real world, when we're doing this in a quality collaborative or in a healthcare system, the folks that are helping us roll out this work may not totally understand why we need to be so concrete and specific, and why certain things need to be standardized and not tailored. And so really thinking through how to engage all of the folks on our team, because I think a lot of times people who have purely a quality background and are not doing this in an academic sense may not totally understand why we're kind of putting structure to some of this work. So thinking through, how do we engage people in doing this work in a way that we can effectively learn as we're going along the path?
All right, I think we have some chat questions. So one of the questions around here is around QI and the IRB, which I think is something that comes up a lot in regards to thinking about quality improvement work and the cross sections between quality improvement and research and implementation science and all of that. So, if anyone wants to talk a little bit about their experience and recommendations in regarding QI work and utilization of an IRB.
I think the chat embodies at least my understanding anywhere I've been, where you can do the QI work. You don't need an IRB to do the QI work, but you really are going to need an IRB, even if it's in an designation of exemption within your IRB, to be able to publish it. So I also don't want anyone to despair if you're mid QI project and now you're motivated to publish. You can certainly get the IRB approval. You don't have to do it like a clinical trial, before you start randomizing. Like, this is something that can be done later, but absolutely for publication, it would be required.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, a lot of places are now developing, we have a QI IRB, and I know there are a lot of places that have that now too. That's a much easier application, and, is probably sufficient for many other terms. Jess Peterson has a question. Are there things we should make sure to put in our manuscripts to help with their appeal to journals? Additionally, I tend to focus on OB specific journals, but what do we think about QI specific journals? No, I mean, I think Sindhu and I have published a little bit in a journal outside of OB, you know, it's like BMC quality and safety or something like that. Yeah, I mean, I feel like my grasp on the world of journals outside of obstetrics is definitely insufficient. So I don't know if anyone has better thoughts on what good places to go are.
I don't actually feel like, I think that just your question about putting what to put in the manuscript, I think it's more about who's interested in the topic that you're writing about. And I think the things that we put in those manuscripts, I think are very, and I published a little bit also with Rebecca and with others outside of OB journals, but I think the sort of general approach and the things you think you'd put in there are not that dissimilar. It's just, I think the sort of idea of like who'd be interested in this study and these outcomes. And I think sometimes it's maybe applicable more broadly to audiences outside of obstetrics. And so the one Rebecca was talking about is BMJ quality and safety, which I actually think is a good one. But I don't feel like our approach or like what we thought about putting in the article was actually very different than what you would normally think about.
I think sometimes there are maybe framing differences. So if we're publishing in a clinical journal, the paper may be more about the clinical topic we're trying to address, both in terms of the intro, the discussion. The papers I've put in quality or implementation science journals have been a little more focused on the methods. So the clinical project itself is almost like the case study for the methods we're using or the approach we're trying to evaluate or what we're learning is sort of more broadly applicable. So we published paper, for example, on champions who lead quality improvement work. And it was a great paper not to put in an obstetrics journal because we wanted everybody who's doing quality type work to be learning about this and thinking about this and, you know, peer reviewing our paper and helping us elevate the quality of the work. Whereas a project that's more about how did we fix this specific problem in obstetrics, it feels like it might have broader impact if that lands in a maternity focused journal with maternity clinicians who are reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. Elevate Dr. Davidson's question. Do journal reviewers have a different approach to reviewing a QI project than statistical analysis?
I mean, I think, Dr. Berghella will answer this way better than I do, but just my quick 2 cents, I think it's all about are you explaining the significance of what you're doing? Is it something that people care about? And do you have rigorous enough methods around it? So again, like we've talked about with QI stuff, it can't be like, well, I chatted with these 3 people and they said I should do this. And so I then did it, but not a description of kind of how and how you iterated, et cetera. So I think it's, I mean, it's different methodologies, of course, but I think in terms of how a reviewer approaches it, I think it's about rigorous application of the science and clear communication, but it's the same stuff, just a little bit of a different field, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I think some reviewers actually like, you know, this work more than, for example, randomized trials or meta-analysis, you know, so I don't think, you know, reviewers, and you know, obviously journals have hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of reviewers, so each is a little bit different, and obviously it's a lottery, you know, when you submit an article, who you're going to get and what they're going to think. That's why I really, you know, for example, that classification, you know, you put in, you know, preeclampsia or quality improvement or whatever, you know, as you submit it, it's so important because if it goes to people, like, you know, if you send something mental health that is novel to Emily, she's going to like it, you know. If you send it to some of you who may not be as interested in mental health, and vice versa, some of you may be more interested in, you know, again, preeclampsia or preterm birth or whatever. So it's really important to get to do the best you can to suggest the right classification so it goes to people that really care, and then also to do it on something that people care about, I think if it's something really rare and compared to, again, FGR or labor or common things, those are obviously liked more usually by reviewers and editors. And the last point, if I can remember, I was going to make is to have a clinical so that there's a clinical thing that people can actually take from that paper. Again, you're going to have most of them are going to be negative, and that's fine. They need to be published. But if your paper does have a clear clinical message, if you do this, people will take the baby aspirin or whatever you're trying to do. That, I think, reviewers like it, that something that is practical, that can be implemented, that can eventually be in the wrong guideline, in a guideline, and in the quality and safety data for the hospital.
Right, Niraj has a long question here. Is it harder to get published with largely process measures as the mainstay of your work? Or do you have thoughts or feedback on the balance between process and outcome measures as your research outcomes? Traditionally, most of our journals are focused on clinical outcomes, and hence I wonder if the emphasis on implementation processes may be somewhat lost. Great.
Yeah, I think it's a really important and really good question. I was just reflecting on most of my mental health work is process outcomes, because that's all I have been able to get so far. And obviously a lot of the times easier to ascertain or measure. I think as long as they're process outcomes with, that are deemed important process outcomes, I think of process outcomes as akin to any intermediate outcome. And honestly, most of our field in obstetrics looks at intermediate outcomes, right? We look at preterm birth as a surrogate marker for longitudinal health of the neonate. It's not like the ultimate outcome we care about, but it's an important surrogate. And so I think process outcomes, if you can justify them as clinically important conduit to healthcare, implementation or whatever ultimate clinical outcome you want to get to, I think you just have a little bit more work to do to justify its impact than some of the more traditional outcome measures or intermediate outcome measures that we are used in obstetrics, because again, we're used to seeing those. But I'd love to hear what other people think.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's very frustrating for somebody who's discovered something that then people don't do. And so even if the outcome is how many pills the person took, they used to take 20% and now took 100%, or they were not doing a timeout before a C-section, before, and now they always do. We know that those things, save lives and improve lives. So you don't necessarily need to have, perinatal mortality, as your or IQ at age 25. Very few papers are able to do that, and we're aware of that. So if we already know that, again, a baby aspirin improves the outcome, and you're showing that by whatever you do, people take the baby aspirin more often, that's enough of an outcome. That there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, I think it depends on the, the evidence base right behind the thing, and, how good do you feel about just increasing the use of the thing instead of looking at the clinical outcome. And I think it depends a little bit sometimes on the clinical scenario that you're in. Like, I think we can all feel like mental health screening is a good process measure, but something, it's really tough. It's really tough. I think on that note, and you started to bring this up earlier, Sindhu, about pre-post studies. I think it was, but like, do you feel like those are still sufficient, or are we at a place where people expect some higher level of rigor in a quality improvement project?
I think it's a tough, I think it's a double-edged sword. I think that on one hand, I think a simple pre-post is probably it does have a lot of limitations, right? And just in terms of kind of thinking about whether the thing you're studying is really leading to maybe the change that you see. And so, at least even adding some things around, ideas of like washout periods and looking for like your slope or your like trends beforehand and just seeing what the trajectory was, like things that making sure the timeframes are similar, like all those things that sort of might impact. So I think there's but I think that there is a role for pre-post with a little bit of like sort of a step up with some of these other pieces. I think, sort of a difference in differences kind of approach probably is is more rigorous, but can be more challenging. And I think, while I think Emily and I joked earlier about, everything is a project, at the same time, everything can't have sort of a level of methodologic rigor that sort of is sort of perfect, being the enemy of good in terms of kind of moving it forward. So I think, picking which things sort of require that rigor because they're more sort of prone to trends or other things impacting the outcome versus things where you can be more confident that the thing you implemented was truly responsible for the outcome that you're seeing, I think is an important thing to kind of think about. So I know that wasn't a totally straightforward answer, but I don't think there necessarily is a totally straightforward answer.
I think the key to that is not is moving. It feels sometimes like pre-post is sort of our default as what's acceptable, and I think we need to, as a field, to move away from that. Like we really need to be thinking about a variety of different designs that might help us be a little better at knowing what's working and what isn't, and for whom and why. So I think diff and diff is great if we can meet every assumption of this kind of difficult design. So sometimes you're kind of left with, as Sindhu was referencing, like more of an interrupted time series, really thinking about how do we elevate pre-post as much as we can in a pragmatic sort of real world context. So I think that the qualitative pieces are also really, really effective here at helping us think about mechanisms. So even if we're not able to get the best possible design, for example, if this is sort of a resident or a fellow project, can we learn something that sets us up for a more rigorous evaluation design in the next step of the way, maybe with larger grant funding to help inform that next phase of the work.
Yeah, that's super helpful. People can feel free to keep putting questions in the chat. My next question is around visualization of data related to QI. I think that the typical sort of run or control chart are the things that we most often see, especially related to a pre-post study. But I know I personally sort of struggle with how best to show data from a QI project sometimes, especially with, multiple changes in the intervention like we were talking about before related to PDSA cycles or, how we're going about doing something. Do you guys have any thoughts on sort of innovative ways to show our data, or what sort of journals are looking for in regards to how to present data?
I don't have any solutions to outcomes dissemination at all, but what I do love is a clean conceptual diagram or process diagram in your beginning. It just makes such a difference because these are complex interventions that we're trying to implement with multiple stakeholders, and you're applying it to different frameworks. And so I think if you have something clean in the beginning that describes like who is contributing to what, I think it's just a phenomenal thing to help your reader distill what will end up being like 3 or 4 paragraphs of your methods, but be able to visualize it with a lot more clarity. So I don't know about outcomes, but I do love a concept or a process diagram.
I love that.
One other, I also I don't know that I'm answering your actual question, but maybe a piece of it. The story is always in the variation. So go find the variation. So if you're, working with multiple sites, the average may not tell the whole story. You may be missing really important pieces to that puzzle. So looking at each site's performance over time, and looking at those monthly or quarterly trends, and really drilling down, looking at groups of providers within a site, looking at groups of patients, figuring out who are the people that did well, even if not many people did, who are the people that did and why. I think that's really powerful. So we often, are thinking about like red, yellow, green. How do we find the people that are like doing really well, people that are not doing well, and the people that somehow magically weren't doing well and are now improving? What are those people doing? So whether that be groups of patients or groups of providers or sites within a larger collaborative, I think that the story's always in the variation. And if you can figure out how to find it, that sometimes inspires what the visuals could look like.
I love Christina's next question, because this came out of a conversation she and I were having in a meeting earlier, which is around, looking at disparities in QI work, which I think, many of us are working on. Is there a best way to define disparities in your outcomes and to visualize them, thinking about run control charts, p-values, other ways to look at disparities, and, whether or not your QI work is actually improving those disparities?
That's such a good question. Thank you for asking it. I think this is not just something we should think about doing, but like we have to do, and we know that many programmatic interventions, when implemented, will improve population health, but actually exacerbate disparities in healthcare. So I think I would amplify what Christina brilliantly asked, but add to it that this should be almost a required portion of it. Like equity is a part of quality, and you can't have quality without it. So I would say that is a requisite outcome if you're going to do any QI work. Hard stop there. How to do it, I'll let my brilliant co-speakers answer.
I totally agree. And thank you for bringing up this question. This is such an important thing for us all to be thinking about. I think patients have to help us define those outcomes. So that is the first step, is asking patients, what does success look like for you? What would be a meaningful change? Because what we define as meaningful may actually not be what matters most to patients, particularly patients that have been marginalized. So I think that is really critical, as we think about stakeholders at the very beginning when we're designing a project, making sure that patients are included in that group who's getting to decide what we do, how we do it, what we measure. I think also for a long time in many fields, including obstetrics, we have prioritized measures of safety, effectiveness, timeliness, and not always looked at patient experience measures. And so I think we also have to recognize the patient experience of care is just as important as these other metrics that we are tracking. And so figuring out how do we bake in that data into our data collection and our evaluation processes. And it can be much harder to capture those things. But we have to secure funding for those things. We have to develop those patient-reported measures so that we have equally good ways to assess that critical component of quality, patient-centeredness and equity, that I think for a long time has been very underdeveloped.
Since we only have a few minutes left, I know Andy wanted to make a comment about doing QI in non-academic settings, which is super important.
Trying to unmute here. Yeah, I just wanted to just remind everybody that more than half the births in the United States take place in non-academic hospitals, and every one of those hospitals has room to improve. And I think we're going to have a separate sort of meeting / seminar / webinar about making QI part of a career path. But I wanted to just point out that you don't have to be in academics to have QI be part of your career path. there's many health systems that want to engage physicians in their quality work. And I think of Larry Shields as an example of that at Dignity Health, and Elliot Main, what he did with Sutter initially, and then with CNQCC, and others. But some of our committee members are in private practice and are doing QI work through their private practice. And to the extent that every one of those hospitals needs somebody doing quality improvement, there's a role for those of you that decide not to stay in academics and eventually move out. My company has been very supportive of the work that I've done in quality improvement in private practice. So that is a viable career path, and you can still publish papers. We don't have the benefit of a nice tight cluster of people that we interact with that are very academic and very publication oriented every day. We tend to work in little silos by ourselves, but we can still do valuable work. And I just want to remind folks that if you do decide to leave academics, there's still life for you in quality improvement.
Andy, I think that's a really important point, because honestly, I mean, right, quality improvement work is our kind of optimizing our clinical care. So it's like sort of like a baseline approach to how we want to always be trying to provide the best care, the most evidence-based care that we can every day for every person. And so I think inherent to that, so this idea that there's like some small group of people that do QI work, I mean, I almost feel like we have to shift our framing into like QI work is just part of everyday improvement in clinical practice, right? And so, and I think the equity part, I think is a really important piece to kind of, as Emily and everyone said, like, that's like a kind of like a drop the mic, like that just has to be a part of how we do things. And the question is like, well, how do you actually do that? And I think there is a new national patient safety goal, right, starting in July, that's actually an equity-based goal that actually is sort of requiring hospitals to think about kind of stratifying data by certain demographics, looking for areas of improvement, coming up with an action plan, coming up with an equity, who's the equity leader in your health system or your hospital. So, you know, even people that are in community hospitals and private practice, you know, being that interest in that, but being that person for your hospital or for your practice is like actually, I think, a really important role to play as we think about how to optimize care more broadly.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today. I know we're coming to our last couple of minutes, so I'm going to close, but you all say things so beautifully, and I really appreciate all of your input today. And I hope this has made a difference for everybody in moving forward with the confidence to write up and publish the work that they're working on.
Yes, a huge thank you to all of you. I was just going to ask, does anyone have any final words of wisdom or pearls that they wanted to give to the group that doesn't come from a specific question that we asked?
Just to emphasize, nothing we talked about is rocket science. And I can say, at least for me, I have very brilliant co-panelists, but if I can do this, anyone here is certainly able to. So please, like, you guys have such innovative ideas in whatever context you're working in, you know, whatever scene. So please keep doing the good work. We can all learn from each other. And I don't know, I was always very intimidated by the people speaking. So don't be intimidated. What we do isn't rocket science.
And please reach out. We like to geek out about these things. So if anybody wants to talk through an idea, we can jump on Zoom anytime.
Absolutely. Tap into the resources. We're all happy to be those.
All right. Well, have a good night, guys. Thanks so much to our panelists and committee members. We have a meeting coming up shortly in just a couple of weeks. So take a look at your calendars for that, for our routine meeting.
Good night, everyone.